Hello and welcome to another afternoon tea and truth afternoon tea and truth biscuits. As you can tell, I've had a nice long break over the summer and I'm a bit rough and ready this afternoon. So I'm going to do my best. And before we move forward, encourage everyone to please subscribe to the YouTube channel, because that really helps me to keep going with these, and support me on Patreon. Today, I'm very excited to welcome to the show my guest, Dmitry Chernobrov, who is a former colleague of mine from University of Sheffield, from the Department of Journalism Studies. And he's also a co-author. So a year or so ago, we published an article called Competing Propagandas, which actually has been one of the most read articles, hasn't it, Dmitry? I'm delighted to say, in the journal Politics in recent months. So I hope everyone will check that out. The journal articles that we're going to be discussing today, including that one, are all listed under the tweets where I've tweeted this out on Twitter. And you can find them also just by Googling if you're finding us through another source. So today we're going to be talking about Dmitry's other paper, which is much more recently published, which is about diasporas as cyber warriors, which is a very exciting topic. Dmitry, it's so nice to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emma. It's fantastic to talk to you. And hello, everybody who is listening and who will be watching this interview afterwards as well. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you. So let's start with the most important question of all. Do you have your tea and truth biscuits with you?
I do. I've got green tea here in a mug from Alaska with a moose. So yeah, it's a special evening. So yeah,
excellent.
all ready.
Well, I have my tea, and I'm staying with friends at the moment, as you can see by the very nice living room, which is definitely not my own, but they have this fabulous teapot, which I'm using today for my tea. Isn't that the cutest? I just love it. I want to take it home with me. I'm cat sitting, and they are a cat loving family, clearly. So I have my tea with me, and without further ado, we should probably sip and chat. And talk about your paper, which just sounds so interesting. And diasporas obviously have been, a part of information operations and information warfare for a long, long time. But perhaps they may be changing in this very new online environment. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. How did you first go about studying this topic?
So one of the main reasons why I focus on diasporas is that they are very often overlooked, and they are a massive, massive resource in times of crisis. So very often when you talk about psyops, or when we talk about information warfare, diasporas seem to be targets, like how do you mobilize diasporas abroad to do certain things? But we can also think of diasporas as assets, as resources, as people who become very active members and participants of the conflict today with the internet. And quite often diasporas outnumber the populations back at home, such as with the case of Armenia and Azerbaijan, where diasporas, for example, are 2-3 times bigger than the population back at home. And so it's not just about economic help, it's not just about the size of the diaspora, but also about diasporas being the perfect people for narrating the conflict to outside audiences, because they speak languages, they live abroad, they have this connection back to the homeland, and they can find the right words and the right way to tell the story that resonates with the communities wherever else they live.
Wow. Yes, absolutely. And they may well also have access to very different information sources, of course, which is...
Absolutely. That's one of the fascinating parts about this research. Is, the first thing I start talking to my participants is, where do they get their information? Because sometimes they would be using sources from homeland, sometimes they would be using local sources. For example, if that's an Armenian person living in the US, They would rely on US news. They would be checking news from back home. They might or might not speak the Armenian language. They may be talking to friends and colleagues. So it is a very fascinating information environment that you first need to map out before you understand how how a person acts and why is that.
So you mentioned Armenia and Azerbaijan. Can you introduce a conflict that you were talking about in this paper a little bit? Because there may well be people who don't know about the specific conflict, which happened in 2020, or maybe just need their memories refreshing. Do you mind?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I wouldn't be surprised if people haven't heard about the conflict. And that's precisely why diasporas feel they're almost obligated to tell the story, because this is one of the conflicts that has kind of passed under the media attention. So international media was paying attention to COVID, to the election in the US. So the conflict I'm talking about is the 2020 war between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. So these are two nations in the Caucasus. They both have a history of being part of the Soviet Union, where borders were drawn and redrawn. And the most recent violence starts in 1988, when for several years there was widespread communal violence between Armenian and Azerbaijani communities. Then this was followed by a full war after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in 1992, 1994, that was the first Karabakh War, which Armenia won. And as the result of that war, the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh became de facto Armenian. So it proclaimed independence, but it has been very closely aligned with the Armenian state, despite under international law being part of Azerbaijan. But then, how do you tell the story of the conflict really is a complex issue, because for many it signals which side do you support.
Yeah.
Because there's a huge historical argument on both sides about why that piece of land is historically part of their country. For Azerbaijan, this is an irredentist conflict. Gaining back control over Karabakh was part of building the modern Azerbaijani state. For Armenians, this is part of historical justice and survival, because that brings back memories of the 1915 genocide in the Ottoman Empire, when hundreds of thousands of Armenians were killed or displaced. And so this conflict kind of never ended. So in 1994, there was a ceasefire, and then there were periodic escalations, most notably the 4-day war in 2016. But then everything changed in 2020. From 27 September to November 10 of 2020, there was this full-scale war between Armenia and Azerbaijan won that. So Azerbaijan won back control over most of Nagorno-Karabakh. And that war ended in a very problematic ceasefire for Armenian side, because effectively this was defeat. There were Russian peacekeepers put in place following the ceasefire. But even today, there are escalations, and again, depending on whether you're checking the news regularly, in the last week, there has been again full-scale fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan on the border. But again, I just emphasize that this is largely a conflict that's ignored by international media, and that makes narration on social media so important, because people are trying to win international public opinion by telling those war stories on social media.
Yeah. Oh, wow. So it's such a personal story for your interviewees as well. Can you tell me a little bit about, what it was like interviewing these people?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I started doing research on Armenia and Azerbaijan a few years ago, before the recent war. I'm interested in issues such as, how do people transmit memories? How do they transmit memories through generations, particularly traumatic memories such as war, conflict, displacement, being refugees, etc. I was looking at Armenian diaspora youth in the UK, in France, some of the bigger and smaller Armenian communities who live all around the world. And how do they transmit the memories of the genocide and then the 1990s Karabakh War to future generations? So I was doing those interviews, and then later in 2018, there was a revolution in Armenia, a pro-democratic revolution. Nikol Pashinyan's government came to power. So again, there was huge hope within particularly Western Armenian diasporas about the country following a completely new path, away from corruption, away from what it was like during Soviet times. And then in 2020, I was doing interviews when the war started. I was doing interviews about the politics of Armenia and about the attitudes to the Velvet Revolution. But as the war started, I reoriented those interviews to how diaspora members were fighting. So we were actually talking to members of the diaspora community as they were fighting online, as their country was at war. Those were incredibly difficult conversations, and I so much appreciate them sharing their stories with me, because that was a very difficult time for them. And then later on, I started talking to the Azerbaijani side as well. And I keep collecting data. That's I'm going to write a book out of it. And so I'm still talking to both Armenians and Azerbaijanis. And one of the reasons I believe that I am able to gather this data is because I'm an outsider to the conflict, but very much familiar with the region. And so I am able to talk to both sides.
Great, yes. And you mentioned your new book. That's great. But you have a book already, which I think it would be great to share a little bit of knowledge about with the audience. And I want to encourage as well the audience to leave any questions or messages that they might like to share in the chat. We will try to answer your questions if we can, but we are very short time. So please, Dmitry, tell them about
thank you, Emma. Yes, indeed, I do have a book which is called Public Perception of International Crisis, and that book was published in 2019 and then won the Furnace Award in International Security. So in that book, I look at how publics understand uncertainty. How do they understand international crises that erupt unexpectedly? And most importantly, I look at how societies idealize themselves when they're faced with an uncertain situation. Because again, I'm looking there in the book, I'm looking at the British and Russian public perception of the Arab uprisings. And I'm looking at how, instead of trying to make sense of the conflict and trying to find out the truth about the conflict or what really happened, both societies quickly escaped into imagining those uprisings in a way that reaffirms their positive sense of self. And so that book is based on interviews, and I talk a lot there about how perception translates into memory, and how in that translation self-idealization is born.
Oh, that's so fascinating. And that's actually quite a contrast with what we were finding in our own paper, which was looking at how propaganda gets discussed by governments in this very technocratic and very, militarized kind of very scary kind of way, that kind of leaves that human kind of element out, I think. And I think people are often alienated by these kind of representations and scared and disempowered, we found, didn't we? And that seems to actually be quite a contrast with what you're finding in relation to public discourses.
Absolutely. I find that governments, in the way they understand and the way they plan for propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, very often they undermine and overlook public agency in this. Because again, if what I did is I went and spoke to members of the public in depth about how they understood what is going on, and the stories they tell, they demonstrate how publics very often interpret new crises in completely new ways, in ways that bring together folk theories of international relations, or common sense, or memories that are seemingly completely unrelated to conflict. To give you a short example, there was. And that's an example I discuss in my book, how a student in Moscow said that she admired Gaddafi. And I said, okay, tell me, why do you admire him? And she said, I don't know much about his policies, but what really makes me respect him is that he died a colonel. He never promoted himself to general or marshal or generalissimus like Brezhnev did in Soviet time. Okay. And again, so that student was applying memory of Soviet leaders promoting themselves completely shamelessly to top military ranks, inventing 5 times heroes of the Soviet Union, etc., and applying that to a completely unfamiliar situation. Now, of course, there was a huge cult of personality with Gaddafi, but that person was not familiar with it, and applying a familiar memory to an unfamiliar situation helped her make sense of it. So that's just one of the examples how publics have huge agency in how they make sense of crisis.
Well, and actually, indeed, we do that in the West all the time with applying our own frameworks of understanding to problems elsewhere. I think every country does that.
Sorry, and in some ways, you know, coming back to diasporas, that's what diasporas try to break, is to tell the story as they see it, as their country sees it, and trying to reach public opinion and kind of tell their truth to them.
So I wanted to ask you, one of the most interesting things about your paper was also how you explain, you know, and use concepts to apply to the interviews. So you walk through sort of 6 observations about you know, diasporas, and I wondered if you could sort of explain those, especially the last one, which I thought was really interesting, about how, you know, these diasporas and the way that they're engaging in conflicts can be culturally and politically transformative experiences. So can you tell us all the different, you know, parts of that 6-part theoretical framework?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I do in the paper is I look at how the Armenian diaspora fought online when their country was at war. And I explore why did they do that? Why do ordinary people, say an Armenian living in the US or in the UK, why do they take to social media, start disseminating information about the war, start posting images, start really, really actively disseminating that information? So I'm looking at their motivations. I'm looking at strategies. How do they do that? You know, an ordinary person who just has a Facebook account, a Twitter account, and, you know, how do they try to engage audiences and to get them to appreciate that there was a war happening and to support a particular side? So I'm looking at their strategies. I'm looking at the way they see the opponent, the pro-Azerbaijani users, for example, online, and the way they see the outcomes of their efforts. But besides talking about just that particular war, I also draw conclusions in the paper about what does it mean for modern warfare and the way it is happening, not just on the physical battlefield, but also on social media spaces, where people are fighting the battle of narratives, not the battle, you know, with arms, with guns for territory, but the battle for public opinion. And so I conclude with several things. One is that war that is happening on social media is increasingly transnational. So what that means is it involves people who are making a very international contribution. So, for example, I spoke to Armenians in Denmark who tried to lobby British journalists, or Russian Armenians who praised the actions of the Canadian Armenian Society, etc. So there was a lot of, you know, battling for foreign audiences, you know, leaving comments to New York Times, for example, by French Armenians who, you know, and in France, people wouldn't necessarily read New York Times. So this is increasingly transnational. I also argue that this war is monologic, and that's one of the, perhaps for me, most surprising findings, is that the whole purpose of that, you know, posting information, disseminating information on social media is not to engage your opponent. It's to drown them. It's to drown them, to make them invisible to the third-party audiences. And that's where one of the most interesting bits comes up, is how modern social media war becomes oriented and adapted to algorithms. So, for example, I'm speaking to Armenian communities and I'm asking them, do you ever engage to comments which support the other side? And they say no, deliberately no, because even if I put a dislike there, it's going to push the comment up according to the algorithms. And so, say a British person who comes into the thread and sees that, they would see not my comment, but the comment which I disliked because it has more, or, you know,
more engagement,
fewer likes, more engagement, exactly. And so the war becomes monologic in the sense that, you know, you shout out in that space and you do not engage the opponent. It's also empowering. So for many of the participants, this ability to post information about the war, share it with friends and colleagues, that meant much more than their skepticism about how effective their efforts are going to be. So they felt they were obligated to do that, to help, because that was the only thing they could do from a distance. And so they did it because they could not just sit and not do it, rather than because they particularly believed it's going to be effective. It's also retaliatory in the sense that all the participants I spoke to, both on the Armenian and Azerbaijani side, believed that the other side was winning this war. and I mean the narrative war on social media. The other side was investing heavily into bots and trolls and posting very actively and kind of winning the battle for public opinion. So their actions were often justified because they seemed to be retaliation to what the opponent was doing, so kind of necessary. I also speak about individual and network tactics. So, if you're an ordinary person and, a war starts back at home and you are posting on social media, you could be doing it, intuitively. How do you think you want to engage people? Maybe you want to use images. Maybe you want to post very actively to be high on social media feeds. Maybe you post, once a day so that people pay more attention. So there are all sorts of individual tactics. There are also network tactics, like people coming into groups, into Telegram, WhatsApp groups, trying to coordinate likes, for example. If somebody posts something pro-Armenian or pro-Azerbaijani on among the comments to New York Times, for example, all the community goes and likes their comment so that it goes up in the visibility. So again, targeting algorithms with groups and networks. But the point you mentioned and you found particularly interesting was about this war, this experience of online social media activism being politically and culturally transformative. And that's where there was all sorts of differences kind of before and after the war. So people, for example, reported that they lost friends. They lost many friends over their silence. They disengaged or unfriended people because those people refused to repost information about the war. People, Armenians and Azerbaijanis, became disillusioned in the power of public opinion because they saw how the real politic, the kind of the superpowers, the military power came to decide the war rather than public opinion. And then they also spoke about how they experienced conflict of interest. So, for example, an Armenian living in the US feeling that their tax money went to NATO, which supports Turkey, which supports Azerbaijan. And so they're kind of paying taxes which indirectly finances the other side in the war. So again, huge disillusionment with host governments in the UK, in the US, in Germany, in other places. So these are some of the conclusions which I draw, which are applicable beyond the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict.
Wow, that's so interesting. Did you also sort of engage with them about deliberate tactics that might be trying to sway them, whether they were aware of this, but either by their government or by the other side?
Yeah, there were participants who said there were bigger efforts to coordinate this, where, for example, the government impressed upon them that winning the information war is important and crucial to winning the actual conflict. Now, it doesn't necessarily say that there were structures put in place to coordinate this, but rather asking all the diasporas, all the communities to play an active role in this. But again, one of the findings, which again is quite unexpected and interesting, is how quite a few people in the diaspora felt that they are part of propaganda. And they were uncomfortable about it. Like, for example, they said, we have to reproduce the casualty numbers that are given by the, say, Armenian or Azerbaijani Ministry of Defense. We can't question that because, who are we? We live thousands of miles away, so we don't know the reality. And if we start questioning our government, then it kind of hurts the cause and paints the whole government in the black light. So many of the participants were conscious that they were potentially reproducing propaganda and fake news, but they decided to do that still because they thought the benefit outweighed the risk, and kind of there was a bigger cause at stake here. So that's just one example how people become active and quite conscious participants of propaganda.
That's interesting. And Kate Starboard talks about participatory propaganda, which is a lot of peeves. And I think, there's a lot more to talk about, involvement of ordinary people in this kind of way. You actually characterize them as cyber warriors. And, that brings me to my next question that I wanted to ask you really is like, are they pawns or participants? Or is it more complex than that? And does it, is it like a dangerous erosion of the distance of civilians from warfare, do you think? Are there risks?
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that, the cyber warrior description is actually theirs, the participants that I interviewed, rather than me imposing a term on them. So when I was speaking to Armenians and Azerbaijanis who were posting on social media, they described themselves as cyber warriors. They saw themselves as part of that war. Wow. So in that sense, from their own perception, they were definitely part of the war effort. Now, if we look at it kind of from a distance and trying to understand whether that erodes civilian combatant lines, to some extent it does, because it erodes the boundaries of war and peace. So, for example, people, and there's this huge turn towards participatory, propaganda, participatory war, etc. in literature, but people become engaged in with war in new ways. And so even when the war itself, the Armenia-Azerbaijan war, ended, the social media war continued. So how do you demobilize people on social media? How do you try to kind of bring down the level of hate speech and hate crimes that are committed? Peace building initiatives do not necessarily look at that. Peace building is still very much about, territory and on the ground peace building, rather than online or social media peace building. So that's, one way in which they become combatants, and it's kind of, they start fighting a different war that goes on and on. Then there's lots of hate crime. Many participants reported death threats and attacks. Some of them had to change their names. Some of them were posting anonymously. There is real danger of prosecution by the other side. Some of them were blacklisted for their activism by the other side. And again, in other conflicts more recently, posting particular things could lead to legal consequences. And then there's also consequences like disagreement. If there were some people in both Armenian and Azerbaijani communities who said, look, I'm not comfortable with that war. But they were not comfortable saying that on social media because they knew that the rest of their group was going to attack them for saying this.
So there's this silencing effect as well.
There's definitely silencing taboo groupthink, kind of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. So absolutely. But if we come back to the question here, who they are, I would probably describe them as activists, information activists. But they themselves describe themselves as cyber warriors or information warriors.
Ordinary people, unlike psychological operations troops, will not have been prepared for that. They are not hiding. They are just being themselves online without probably as many precautions as actual military personnel would have around them. They don't have military backup or anything like this. They don't have their government enabling and protecting them in these kinds of ways, and they don't need to know how to deal with the consequences of any of that. So it really has quite major implications, doesn't it? Do you see any ways that we can, what we should be doing about this, both in terms of, the after effects that you talk about, about peace building, but also like, how do we protect people from this? And should we be stopping people becoming involved in these kinds of conflicts through changing the online environment? What do you think?
Well, there's a very fine line here between being politically active on social media, right, voicing opinions, etc., and becoming a warrior, and then becoming a propagandist, in a sense, a participatory propagandist.
But so, it's a wobbly line, is it not?
It is a very wobbly line. It depends on what information you trust, right? What information you truly believe in, and that you are spreading awareness rather than you're spreading misinformation. So there's definitely a fine line here, and there's also society pressures in terms of group pressures within diasporas, or people pressing their friends who are not Armenian or not Azerbaijani to post something or to react in some ways, and unfriending people if they ignore silences. And then there would be people who are uncomfortable with all of that, because this becomes a heated debate, a very kind of hostile debate. So definitely there's lots of room for regulation in terms of hate speech and hostile environments. There's also room for understanding how visibility algorithms work, and how they can be twisted and manipulated in times of war, where the whole efforts of ordinary people or trolls come at pushing certain hashtags into trending, for example, or liking or unliking comments, etc. So there is room for regulation there. But what I think has to happen in particular is crisis resolution NGOs, for example, peace building initiatives, governments need to appreciate that war isn't just happening on the physical battlefield. It's also happening in the narrative dimension on social media, elsewhere in the information domain. And so running peace building initiatives, bringing communities together online is something, and a new dimension of peace, which has to be explored.
Wow. Yes. How do you do that? By respecting people's differing views as well. That's a really complex conundrum, isn't it? On that
absolutely,
note,
absolutely.
We probably should wind down the show. I've really enjoyed this chat, though, and I hope the audience will check out all of your amazing publications. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dmitry.
Well, thank you, Emma. It was a pleasure, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. People are welcome to email me at my University of Sheffield account, and then the full text of the article is can be found in the International Affairs Journal.
Wonderful. And they can also see the tweets. We've shared the articles and information about this. So thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you for having me.
Okay.
Bye.
See you again soon, everybody. Bye.